I think is very significant and generally
for 1,000 years.
spoke. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring to your attention
1,000 years. And the Africans joined this new force that was good and bad. Christianity had been born by the Africans in peace, in love, and in decency, and great spirituality. The Europeans took it over and had killed its true meaning and opened the door for a new religion. And I'm saying that both Islam and Christianity need to be examined in this regard, because it will be the role of the African and the role of the African alone.
they are. This doesn't make any difference. What are you talking about? Who will speak first? And I think when you have something to say, your ego never gets in the way. Dr. Clarke will be our first speaker. And Dr. Clarke will be presenting an aspect of the Garvey movement that I think is very significant and generally overlooked. Dr. Clarke will be addressing Marcus Garvey and the process of state formation. Marcus Garvey and the process of state formation. After Dr. Clarke speaks, Dr. Ben will be presenting to us philosophical concepts of Garvey and his African nationalism. And Dr. Ben would like to emphasize the word his, in that topic. So Dr. Clarke will speak first, then Dr. Ben, and we will have a question and answer period after the two brothers have spoke. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring to your attention Dr. John Hendrick Clarke.
Thank you very much. This is my third visit to Hofstra. I'm very pleased to be here again, and I'm pleased to greet some of the same students again, and pleased that Dean Smith saw fit to invite me, and pleased that the president, with all the many things the president has to do, have taken time out to attend the lectures. Now, I'm talking about Marcus Garvey and the concept of state formation. I will begin by seemingly talking away from the subject, but I will be on the subject all of the time. And I will waste no time with trivia, because the subject is bigger than the time allotted for it. What do we mean by state formation? There's some missing pieces in the history of African people that keep being missing because we do not look beyond what Professor Van Sedema calls the slavery curtain and the 500-year room when our history was locked into a room marked slavery, and we did not move it beyond that room or look at it before that room. We did not consider the fact that for most of the time African people have been on the earth. They have been free people determining their own destiny, and they have not been slaves. In the period of slavery, for the Africans was short in comparison to other periods of slavery in the world. In fact, Europeans enslaved other Europeans for a longer period. To talk about state formation, in the restoration of state formation, we must speak at least briefly of independent states in Africa before the slave trade and how these independent states were lost. And with the loss of these independent states, the beginning of the slave trade in the 15th and the 16th century, the African was programmed into thinking that he had never ruled a state. And they were systematically read out of the respectful commentary of history. And so many times when the African away from home mentions slavery, the assumption is that is his total experience in history, because no one dares to look and see what happened before slavery. No one dares to say that slavery is an evil that has touched every people on the face of the earth sometime or the other, some way or the other. While the slavery that happened to Africans is the most documented and the most remembered, it might have been the most severe, it is not the only. Now, let us look at the certain basic things that happened in Africa before slavery. Now, with the decline of the 25th dynasty, the last of the dynasties that came out of southern Africa, the Kushite dynasty, often called the Ethiopian dynasty, sometimes called the Nubian dynasty. With the decline of this dynasty, you can stop counting great dynasties. Because from then on, the foreigners, the invaders, the bastardized children of bastards began to rule the Nile Valley. This ultimately led to other invasions. The Assyrians, 666, then the Iranians again, then called Persians, 550. So brutal that the Africans cried out, "Oh God, if you cannot send me a liberator, at least send me a conqueror that will show some mercy." So when a young Macedonian, known in history as Alexander the Great, knocked at the door, he didn't have to knock very hard. The African, weary of brutal invaders, was not harsh on Alexander, who partly tried to keep the promise. He was an invader like all invaders, a raper. He raped the granary of Africa, feed his soldiers. This part of Africa was a great agricultural country at the time. Now this fauna was followed by a more brutal form of European, the Romans. And when the Romans stopped killing Christians and tried to become Christians, their mismanagement of this church and the dissatisfaction around it opened the door for the rise of Islam. The rise of Islam and Arab armies and African armies pushed the European back into Europe, where they went into the Middle Ages, while the Africans, Arabs and Berbers took over Spain and the Mediterranean. After the Crusades, Europe discovered that it was still hungry, still had lost 1/3 of its population, still was looking for roots to the east, something like spices, something they could put on that gosh darn awful European food so they could eat it. Europe was in a bad way. They lost all sentimental attachment to themselves and to other people. They learned again maritime skill, mostly taken from China, translated by the Africans, Arabs, and Berbers at the University of Salamanca in Spain. They began to learn map making again and charting again. And to learn the coast of Africa, they discovered something called the Captain Atlas, and a catch of maps made by Jewish gold dealers who had been going into Africa dealing in gold in the Western Sudan. These are the maps that fell into the hands of Prince Henry, called Henry the Navigator. Now, with Europe on the rise again, back at sea again, they wasn't looking for Africa at all. They were looking for a route to the east. Africa appeared en route and proved to be more beneficial to them. Now, to justify slavery, they had to pretend that they were enslaving a people who had no history and who had no culture. And they forgot that there was another cluster of nations in inner Africa called the Western Sudan, nation that did not touch the sea, that had brought into being for over 1,000 years nation states. I'm not talking about grass huts and mud huts. I'm talking about nation states with ambassadors, with roads, with schools. And the last state, Sangay, a great university, St. Corey, a great scholar exiled by the Moroccans. This state was literally destroyed by an invasion from Morocco, Muslim against Muslim, using European mercenaries. Now, after this invasion and the wreck and ruin in the Western Sudan, the slave trade could spread inland. Because it is difficult to enslave a historical people, the rationale now is that these people had no history and no culture. And they forgot that Africans were in charge, and for many years, of the two major universities of the world, Salamanca in Spain, St. Corey at Timbuktu. Europe now had to forget the first African-European connection, the Romo-Grecian period. Now, you can charge the Romans and the Greeks with many things, but generally they did not have color prejudice. They were snobs and they had a whole lot of things, and they had preferences, but there's a whole lot of difference between that and prejudice based solely on color. Now, my point is, how did we lose the nation state? We began to lose the nation state when foreigners began to invade with weapons that we had never seen before, weapons that lacked humanity, that we had never even entertained using before and would not have used if we had them. Anytime you want to find out the weakest thing of about a people, look at the flip side of the weakest thing about a people, and you'll find potentially the strongest thing about a people. There was something in African humanity. It did not lean to the total destruction of other people, similar to the Europe without sentiment of that day. Now, the traffic was not heavy between the beginning of the trade in the 1430s, 1438 to be exact, and 1492. You can't start a trade until you've got something for people to do. But the beginning of the trade, the opening up of the so-called New World, Africans began to be brought to South America and the Caribbean islands. The focal point here is the Caribbean islands. And the peopling of the Caribbean islands by Africans after the destruction of the Indians would create small island nations under different colonial domination. Now, to understand the background for Marcus Garvey, in the beginning of his concept of state formation, you got to look at Jamaica. You got to look at Jamaica's struggle against slavery and the fact that Jamaica fought harder than Haiti and did not achieve independence. principally because they were destabilized in between battles. Haiti, for over a 20-year period, and they could take impetus from one revolt to start another revolt. And another incident, an item left out of history, is that Bookman, the Yoruba priest who solidified and organized the revolt in Haiti, was originally from Jamaica. When you look at the relationship of Jamaica and Haiti in the transformation of the system of slave revolts, here two nations, two island nations, were the people remembering that they had not always been slaves, making an attempt to regain the concept of the nation state. When the British came, they wanted help from the slaves against the Spaniards. Some went to the hills and said, I don't want either one of you. These runaways were called Maroons. Marcus Garvey was a descendant of the Maroons. Now, the Maroons are a special kind of Jamaicans. They're black and proud, and some of them were exceptionally skillful. Marcus Garvey was a master printer, so therefore he was also a reader. He was revolutionary from the beginning, with revolutionary ideas, calling the first printer strike in Jamaica, visiting South America and Central America, and causing trouble wherever he had went, organizing Caribbean workers in the Panama Canal area. So Marcus Garvey had a sense of the state and what he had to do to regain it early in life. Now he would go to England. He would read. He would hook up with Duz Muhammad Ali, a an Egyptian of Sudanese descent, in a newspaper called the African Times and Orient Review. He would read an editorial quoting, of all things, a white black nationalist named Booth, who had gone through parts of East and Southeast Africa. Because he was dissatisfied with the missionaries, he began to preach against them all. And he began to tell the Africans that the white man cannot be trusted. And when the African finally said, well, you're white, can you be trusted? To his everlasting credit, he said, no. Who raised the first one to raise the choir, Africa for the Africans? Marcus Garvey read the editorial in Duz Muhammad Ali's paper and added Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. Marcus Garvey never took anything from a second rater. He read fast and he learned fast. Now he's in London at the time of the race conference. There's a world conference on race. He's got that literature to read. The great activists from Ghana, Casely Hayford, John Mensa Sabah, now publishing their books, first in London, then secondly in Africa. He's got that literature to read. So he's absorbing the literature of the state. And the first version of a book that was going to be published, an extensive version in 1929, toward nationhood in West Africa. He would read. He's absorbing the concept of the state and the idea of regaining the state. Now he was to go back to Jamaica, and he would try to start the Universal African Improvement Association, Universal Negro Improvement Association. Why didn't he succeed in Jamaica? He didn't succeed in Jamaica then, and he wouldn't succeed in Jamaica now. The mentality was not there.
Why didn't the Jamaicans buy the concept of the restoration of a state? Because they thought they already belonged to a state, the British Empire. And so his call for a state in Jamaica, his call for the return to Africa in Jamaica did not fall on listening ears. He heard about a man named Booker T. Washington, and he wrote him. And Booker T. Washington invited him to the United States. He couldn't get the money ready by 1915, but when he arrived in 1916, Booker T. Washington was dead. Now, he would tour the United States in 1917. The riots beginning to start. 1919, the Red Summer. In East St. Louis, they made bonfires and burned black babies to death. Now, after the riot in Chicago, where Marcus Garvey would rally blacks to fight back, he could now say to them, let's get out of here. Let's get out of our own ships and sail back to Africa. Why did black America listen to the concept of the nation state and others did not listen? It had nothing to do with anybody having a better brain than the other. We were both under different oppressors. One oppressor gave you the illusion that you had a state. But the American oppressor did not even give us the illusion that we had one, ever would have one, or would be capable of having one, ruling one if we did have one. Europe dumped its human garbage can into the Western world. The worst of that garbage can was dumped into the United States. No illusions. The British oppressor was not less of oppressor. He was a more mature oppressor. He had style, procedure. He would not cut your throat with a dirty knife, not because he cared anything about you or your throat, but it was poor style. He lacked form. It must be in good form, in good order. He was a mature oppressor. And you had a growing amateur oppressor in the United States, rather crude in comparison. So now, because Marcus Garvey had gotten across in this country something he couldn't get across in Jamaica. The American dream wasn't dreamed for you. The American promise wasn't made to you. I will dream for you a new dream, make a new promise, and lead you to a new land. The next year, he would call an international conference of African people, 30,000 people a day, and he turned away 30,000. Old Madison Square Garden. There have been 2 Madison Square Gardens since then. Now, he would propagate the concept not only of a nation state, but of Africa's return to a nation state. He would begin to prepare the mind to think of a time in the world, in your history, when you ruled a state all by yourself, collected all the taxes, headed the army, did everything the nation state need to do, received ambassadors, sent ambassadors. It would also remind us that in collective unity, we were a very powerful people in the world. We had been before and would be again. In spite of all of the forces arrayed against him, propaganda and otherwise, in spite of the fact that a good percentage of the people in his office was on the FBI payroll, The triumph of his movement was one of the great miracles, one of the great organizational miracles in the history of the United States. He now began to touch a people that had never been touched. He didn't have to steal them from the big church because it wasn't in the big church. He didn't have to steal them from the big organization. They were not in the big organization. He spoke a language that filtered down to the common man and woman, to the ordinary workaday man and woman. The membership in the Garvey movement, rather reasonable, like 50 cents a week, 10 cents burial benefit for burial insurance. That's rather reasonable that day. Well, considering the fact that people were making $10, $15, $20 a week, it was still reasonable. Then he projected a dream that made people feel whole again. Imagine a black elevator operator, elevator starter, downtown New York. People say, "Hey George," call him everything. He was "Hey George" down there, but in the evening, with Garvey's paramilitary organization, he was a major and a general, controlling his troops for an empire still to come. Our mind in America was so depressed, we, more than any other African people in the world, needed a Marcus Garvey. We needed him to save us from believing that we were not going to make it as a people, for saving our sanity. Now, he began the collecting of funds for the ships, the Black Star Line. This will lead to difficulty later, but the main thing is that the Black Star Line was part of the concept of nation. He discovered that the shipping lines were so costly, and even transferring goods and services between African nations and African nations. He dreamed of a steamship line where Africans could connect with each other and trade with each other on terms. He prophesied the modern age. Now let's look at what could have happened just briefly. While we naively answer to the term minority, we were never a minority. We are ruled over by a numerical minority and don't even know it. Now, if you count all the African people in the United States, 30 million or more. In the West Indies, those in South America, especially Brazil, that has 80 million. You got about 200 million in the Western world. All the African people in the Pacific, 2 Pacific nations at the United Nations right now. African nations in the Pacific with slight Polynesian admixture, like the Australian Aborigine. People in other areas of the Pacific. A man came to our conference in Egypt this summer. He was a Dravidian. He represents 10 million people of African descent. Now, he wants to hook up again with African people. There's a new book called Delhi, dealing with the black untouchables of India. So there's upward of 100 million people of African descent in India. I know you met some brown races, but be that as it may, a whole lot of Indians are of African descent. Now these Indians of African descent want a connection with the rest of Africa. Now we
and the Chinese might be the only people on the face of the earth who can count 1 billion people as part of our group. Or if you want an economic system, make shirts for 1 billion people, make shoes for 1 billion people, make cars for 1 billion people, have the ships to transport goods and services for 1 billion people. This is part of Marcus Garvey's dream. Nationness. And if you're going to have a nation, then you have to do everything people have to do in order to maintain a nation. His Liberia scheme consisted of sending men ahead of time who could manage brickyards, build bridges, lay railroads. He was thinking about the structure and the concept of nation. No one in the Western world, least of all the imperial powers, and America is an imperial power, wanted African people to emerge again in the world as the rulers of nations. You can bargain then. This is why all Africa is fragmented. This is no accident. Mostly fragmented by Western educated Africans. We have to think this over again. He kept telling us that the best education that we must have for nation would have to come from ourselves. He understood then what we do not understand now. Powerful people never educate powerless people in how to take their power away from them. Education has but one honorable purpose. One honorable purpose alone. Everything else is a waste of time. That is to train the student to be a responsible handler of power. Now, Marcus Garvey's venture with the ships led eventually to his arrest and imprisonment. And from his imprisonment, deported back to Jamaica. You might think the story ends right there. But during the Italian-Ethiopian War, a lot of Marcus Garvey's prophecy came to pass. He said, no, look, see what happens? If you don't prepare yourself, any thug and his brother can come in and knock over your country, rape your women, kill off your educators. And he was hard on Haile Selassie for leaving Ethiopia. He kept reminding them then that had you managed this state differently, had you made a hookup with other African people in the world instead of trying to prove that you're a Hamite or Semite, you got more help. Italians from the United States had no problem in going back and fighting for Mussolini. Why do we have so much problem going back and fighting for Ethiopia? They wouldn't have permitted us to do it in any case. Because they did not want us to relate to the concept of nation state. Marcus Garvey was the inspiration for the basis of the African independence explosion. He was the stimulation behind Nkrumah, especially Nkrumah, the first Pan-Africanist president, Nnamdi Ezekwe, Nigeria, Johnston Kenyatta, before he started calling himself Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. Marcus Garvey's inspiration to them from London, where he had lived for a number of years, helped to stimulate the concept of African freedom. And most of them, when they were willing to admit it, admitted that Marcus Garvey was the basic stimulation in their thrust for independence in Africa. And the restoration again of the independent state. Now the story is bigger than that. I have not dwelt with Garvey's second Jamaican years. We went back to Jamaica. Once more the Jamaicans would not listen, because Jamaica is the most stratified island, nation in the world along color and class lines, still is. If Marcus Garvey were alive today, walking through the streets of Jamaica, some misguided Jamaican might stone him to death. There is no Garveyism in the Caribbean today, very little Garveyism in the United States among black Americans today. Because if you think Garveyism, you don't think integration. Because if you want to integrate in somebody else's house, if you think Garveyism, you want to build your own house. And that factor is missing. All right, how then, in conclusion, how then do we use Garveyism at the end of the 19th as we face the 21st century? We use Garveyism to unify the African world across all religious and political lines, and to bring to ourselves once more the stability of the nation state. Of course, all of us in the United States are not going back to Africa. Go psychologically if you can't go physically. But if there's one place in the world Africa can turn to and say, send me 10,000 nurses, it's the United States. Probably couldn't send 10,000 doctors, probably couldn't even afford that many, but we could manage 5,000. Because in the United States, you've got the best technical trained Africans in the world. Now, they're confused with that technical training. I'm not saying they're committed to Africa with it. Kids study engineering, he'd rather go work for IBM or AT&T than to go to Africa. So long as you've got that kind of hang up, you're missing the point that I'm trying to get across. But I'm saying that with basic skills in road building and communication, building in general, managing school systems, managing hotels, the African in the United States might be the key or the lock to the Africa of the future. But if you think this is a betrayal of the United States, then you're missing the point again. Because there's nothing that you betray that the country didn't say it stands for. Not that it lives up to what it stands for, but it says it stands for. Then you have to do some reading in history. I don't believe there's a capitalist solution to Africa's problems. I don't think there's a communist solution either. I don't think there's any solution that you do not control and control well in Africa's behalf. I think the individualism of the Western black might have spoiled most of them for service in Africa. Africa had a collective society, not based on the needs of the individual, but based on the needs of the whole group. And many times, Africa had a classless society and a sharing society, not only before Karl Marx, but before the existence of Europe. An African king, Pharaoh, Akhenaten, preached the same concept from a throne 1,300 years before Christ. So if you want socialism, you can get some at home. You don't have to go across and get it from cause something or another. But if cause something or another got anything that you can use for your benefit, use it. But don't forget to bend it to your benefit. Everything, every religion, every social organization has become an instrument of liberation, or it must become nothing, or you must discard it. You have to travel fast and with some light luggage. And you can't have any excess baggage holding back this matter. I think every true African, every true liberating person, every true person committed to the liberation and the unification of all African people have been saying one way or the other what Marcus Garvey said through his life and said repeatedly, up, up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will.
Before I introduce our next speaker, I'll provide one more opportunity. If several people want to just come up in front and sit down on the floor, you can feel free to do that. I want to thank Dr. Clarke very much for his very eloquent statements, and as I said, at the conclusion we will provide time for questions and answers. As I earlier stated, Dr. Ben will be addressing philosophical aspects of Garvey and his African nationalism. Dr. Yosef Ben Yaakov.